As Byron said, we've had a long interest in marriage preparation. We, with a group of other couples, began a program in Melbourne in late 1980, and it's been something which we've had a practical involvement in for a long period of time. But through that, I started to look at the research about what makes marriage work and why do marriages break down and what are the changing factors, what are the facts on the ground that Archbishop Coleridge talked about. And that led, as Byron said, to the writing of Maybe I Do and the collecting of about 40 years of social science research together, particularly in the original volume or the original edition of the book, which is now sold out, but there's a concise edition which is available. And what it shows, if I can just work out how to work this, what it shows is that survey after survey basically show that people want to have a stable family and marriage. Most people aspire to a happy family and marriage. And indeed, marriage remains popular amongst young people. But as we know, today they're not in a rush to tie the knot, something that Archbishop Mark referred to. Most people indeed hope to have children, and they actually believe, in survey after survey, not just in Australia but around the world, that the best place for children to grow up in is with a couple who are happily and stably married together. And indeed, you wouldn't necessarily believe this from reading the popular media, but surveys again show that most people are happy in their marital relationship. So that's the aspiration, if you like, and that hasn't changed over the years or over the decades. And yet there's been a significant number of changes over the past 4 or 5 decades in particular, a decline in marital permanence. Firstly, we know that the marriage rate has actually fallen. Yes, as Byron says, more people are getting married, but the population is growing. And if you look at the marriage rate over the last 4 decades, it's effectively halved. Secondly, premarital cohabitation has become ubiquitous. 80% or so, 4 out of 5 couples live together before they get married, and we'll come back to say a bit more about that. We know that divorce has increased significantly, not only in Australia, but right across the Western world. The divorce rate in the last 40 years has doubled. Many more children are therefore now involved in divorce. About 50,000 children each year in this country experience the divorce of their parents, and remembering that more people live together than actually formally marry, so that 50,000 is actually a very significant underestimation of the impact of divorce and separation on children in our society. And anybody who has any involvement in schools in this country will know the impact of that in terms of children in the classroom. We also know that the rates of remarriage has fallen. And this is surprising because one of the great promises of the divorce law reforms in the 1960s and in Australia the 1970s was that people could exit one unhappy relationship and then go into another relationship which would work out. Indeed, what's happened over the last 4 decades is the rate of remarriage in this country has fallen by to about a third of what it was 4 decades ago. We also know that families are having fewer children. The birth rate in Australia is back down to about 1.9 children per woman, which is less than the replacement rate needed for the population. The proportion of children born out of wedlock has increased dramatically. It's now over 1/3 in Australia. That is behind some other countries. Across the Tasman, it's closer to 50%. In America and the UK, for example, we're looking at an out-of-wedlock birth rate of somewhere in the order of 1 in 2 of every children. There are more single-parent families in our society. It's in fact doubled over the last few decades. Increasingly, both parents are in the paid workforce, and of course we know, not just in Australia, but indeed across the whole world, the population is ageing. Yet despite all this, as Professor Paul Amato has said and summarised it, we know that studies consistently show that children raised by 2 happily and continuously married parents have the best chance of developing into competent and successful adults. Now, this wasn't always believed to be the case, and I use the words of Paul Amato because he was one who had a different view about 25 years ago. Paul Amato, Professor of Sociology at Penn State University, one of the leading sociologists of the family and marriage in the world, a recognised expert, actually worked here in Australia at the Institute of Family Studies about 30 years ago. And when he was at the Institute of Family Studies, he wrote a book in which he said the opposite. He said, according to the times, I suppose, of introduction of divorce laws and the like, that this wouldn't have an impact on children. Yet through his research, Paul Amato has changed his mind and now says the opposite is true, that in fact what's best for children is what we've known all along. And he says it not from some ideological conviction, far from it. He says it on the basis of years and decades of research into this. Archbishop Coleridge talked about being in touch with the facts and engaging with the culture. And therefore we have to ask the question, why this retreat from marriage within the space of the lifetime of everybody in this room, apart from the children? Why this retreat from marriage? And I believe it's because of, in part, some understandings, some what I would call myths that are prevalent today in our society. Now, the real meaning of myth is a truism, but the modern way in which we use the word myth is something which people believe in, which may or may not be true, and I'm using it in that modern sense. And there are a number of myths about marriage which I write about in more detail in Maybe I Do, but I just want to run through them briefly with you this morning. And essentially the 8 myths are: there's a 50% chance of divorce, it's preferable to marry later, there's nothing we can learn about marriage, marital satisfaction necessarily declines over time, marriage is private and natural, conflict destroys a marriage, a good divorce is beneficial for children in particular, and fathers are dispensable. And one might add something, mothers are dispensable as well. So let me just address each of these in turn. A 50% chance of divorce. How does people come up with such a figure? Well, what they do in Australia is they say there's roughly 100 to 110,000 marriages, weddings each year, and there's roughly 50 to 55,000 divorces each year. So you've got a 50% chance of divorce. What's wrong with that equation? The divorces come from all the weddings, all the marriages, over the lifetime of people. And so it's the comparison of apples and oranges that doesn't actually make much sense. Indeed, if you look at the data from the Australian Bureau of Statistics, and this is supported by similar data in other Western nations, currently what you can say is that about a third of marriages will end in divorce. Or in other words, 2/3 of marriages will actually end in the death of one partner or the other. That's not what the popular belief is about marriage. And the risks vary greatly. We're not homogenous as individuals. We're not homogenous as couples. And therefore, if we start to look at the risks, and this is one study of women in America, the factors that are influential in terms of the percentage of a decrease in the risk of divorce. So take the first one. Again, American study, so compare it, use your own thinking to think about what this means in Australia. If you have an income of over $50,000 annually versus under $25,000, there's a 30% decrease in the risk of divorce. Secondly, if you've graduated from what the Americans call college, we would say tertiary educated or university here in Australia, versus not having finished high school, not having finished secondary school, then there's a 25% decrease in the risk of divorce. If you have a baby 7 months or more after you get married versus having a child before you get married, there's a 24% decrease in the rate or risk of divorce. If you marry after 25 years of age versus under 18, then the American study shows a 24% decrease in the risk of divorce. If you come from an intact family of origin versus having divorced parents, a 14% decrease in the risk of divorce. And if you are religious, you have a religious affiliation versus none, there's a 14% decrease in the risk of divorce. Now think about it for a moment. How many of the young people, the young couples that you're working with in marriage preparation have actually a combination of those factors, who may earn more than $50,000, who have finished tertiary studies, who don't have a child before they get married, who marry, as they do these days, in their 30s rather than in their teens? For those couples, there's a combination of factors which actually substantially reduces their risk of divorce. In fact, for somebody who is well off, middle class, been to college or university, who doesn't have a child before they get married, the chances of divorce today are not much different to what they were in 1960. But there's this myth out there that there's a 50% chance of divorce. And I think that's one of the reasons why there is some reluctance to marry on the part of many people. The second myth is that cohabitation improves the chances of marital success. Well, we know that cohabitation, as I said, is ubiquitous and it leads to marriage or separation. For a significant number of emerging adults, they're significantly hurt by those separations, even though they'd never been married. And indeed, the evidence is mixed as to whether or not cohabitation after having decided to marry is unharmful. We know that young adults these days are searching for a soulmate. It's become the common expression amongst young people. And that's someone with whom they can make an emotional connection for life. The majority, as I said, of young adults cohabit before marriage, but only about half of those cohabitations actually lead to marital status, to a marriage, a wedding with their partner. About the other half, a few stay in a long-term cohabitation, but more than 40% of those cohabitations break up, a separation occurs. And indeed, cohabitation tends to follow earlier experiences of short-term or short-lived sexual relationships. So in sociological terms, cohabitation is an unstable relationship. Unstable because only about half of them actually are maintained into the future. Yet we know from surveys, from talking to young people, that they believe that cohabitation is a good way to test their readiness, their compatibility and their marital commitment. Yet there is no evidence, can I repeat that? No evidence that cohabitation lowers the risk of divorce, and indeed many studies show that there are higher risks. Couples who cohabit appear to have higher risks of divorce than those who don't, and cohabitation indeed has been associated with lower levels of marital happiness and commitment. This is what the social scientists, people like Scott Stanley at the University of Denver, call the cohabitation effect. So let me just break down this a little bit more. We find from the social science that the cohabitors increasingly fall into two groupings: those who cohabit to marry and those who cohabit until further notice. There's a group that enter into, if you like, an informal marriage, that the purpose of the cohabitation is to get married. But there's another group, probably the 50% that end up breaking up, and others perhaps, that are cohabiting because it's convenient, because they're in love with each other for whatever reason. It's cohabitation without having made a commitment to marry. It's cohabitation until further notice. And many of these couples then slide into marriage rather than having made at the outset a firm decision that this is a process, a pathway that leads to marriage. And what we seem to find from the social science evidence, that those couples who enter into an informal marriage, that is, they've decided that this is a pathway to marriage, they don't seem to have much different risk of divorce than people who don't live together. But those who cohabit until further marriage, until further notice, and then slide into marriage, they have much higher risk of divorce if they do ultimately get married. And of course we know, it's been talked about by many, that the modern companion of marriage, which is widely preferred these days, yet is a very difficult thing to sustain. So that second myth, that cohabitation is preferable for a variety of reasons, needs to be unpacked. And with couples we're dealing with, what does that really mean for them, and what's the decision-making process? Thirdly, the myth is that it's preferable to marry later. Now, we know from lots of social studies, scientific social studies, that teenage marriage is associated with higher risks of marital instability, that divorce proneness decreases with age. But what some of the more recent studies show is that there doesn't seem to be any positive effect beyond about the mid-20s. And indeed, one study said that the best time to be getting married is sometime between about 25 and 28 years of age. Most couples these days, on average, are older than that when in fact they get married. As Tony Kerrin, who's here in the audience today, once said that long courtships may indeed indicate an unwillingness to commit, and that's something that may be a factor. And of course, as Bernard Salt has controversially pointed out, there is a marriage market, particularly for women, and it's the reality that there are less eligible men as a ratio once women turn 30, and therefore there is a marriage market out there as well. So the idea that it's preferable to marry later has got some basis for it, but once you get beyond about the mid-20s, there's not much social science evidence to support the contention. Fourthly, the myth is that marriage is private and natural. And I don't need to explain this to marriage educators, but it has two consequences which are unhelpful. Firstly, it delays couples seeking help, and secondly, it says to them, I don't need education or support, and then if problems come along in a marriage, well then I don't need therapy or counselling or support that might be able to be provided to them. Fifthly, there's a myth that marital satisfaction necessarily declines over time. And it's true that there is a honeymoon effect in relation to marriage. But other studies, recent studies, show that this is challenged, and in fact, a great majority of marriages do not exhibit any aspects of decline over a period of time. That's not to say that there are not ups and downs in a marriage, there is. But in terms of long-term satisfaction, recent studies show that for a great majority of couples, there is not a decline in satisfaction. Sixth is one which I probably don't need to explain to marital educators, particularly those who are familiar with the work of John Gottman, but it's the myth that conflict destroys a marriage. In fact, all relationships involve conflict, which tends to be either resolved or perpetuated. And there are different styles in a marriage, again according to Gottman, the validating style, the conflict-avoiding style, or the volatile style. And each can be prone to separation and divorce. It doesn't mean that one is better than the other in terms of the actual outcomes. And indeed, low conflict doesn't necessarily equate to marital happiness. And what is important is acknowledging faults while maintaining the view that marriage itself is important. And as those who are familiar with Gottman know, it's the four horsemen that he refers to: criticism, contempt, defensiveness and stonewalling, which undermine marital happiness. The seventh myth is that a good divorce is beneficial for adults and children, popularised by the book written by Constance Arams in, I think, 1983, which was entitled The Good Divorce. And yet we also know from studies that the separated and divorced are less happy on average than the married, including the most unhappily married. And that's an Australian study by Maria Evans here in South Australia. People underestimate the extent that divorce is actually a major disruption on their lives. Children from low conflict marriages are the worst affected by divorce because they think things are going along well, and then they wake up one day or 1 week and parents have separated and divorced and they wonder why. And of course children also wonder, why was it my fault? Was it something that I did or didn't do? And so children from low conflict relationships where a divorce occurs are those that are most affected by the divorce. And we know that up to 1/3 of children lose all contact with one parent, and even parallel parenting is disruptive of the lives of children. And my final myth is the one that fathers are dispensable. And as I said, if I was writing the book now, I'd probably add mothers are dispensable as well as one of the myths that seem to be propagated. We know that fathers play an important role in the lives of their children. They have a positive impact on the health, well-being, education and life outcomes for their children. And even where fathers don't share a home, where separation has occurred, their involvement, their continuing involvement, can have a lasting and positive impact on the lives of their own children. So why is it important to understand this? I think it enables us, when we're counselling, when we're educating, when we're working with young couples, and I think in particular with younger people in schools who are subject to these same myths, these same beliefs in the society in which we live, that we can start to unpack them and say, you might think that, but let's have a look at what the evidence shows, what the social science evidence actually shows. And I think if we're doing that, we're helping in terms of their formation, helping them to come to decisions based on the facts rather than the myths that abound in the community in which we exist. So what does make a marriage work? I suppose the day after my 37th wedding anniversary, I have a little leeway to make some suggestions. I could probably say what doesn't make it work, but look, once upon a time we thought as marriage educators that provided you knew how to communicate well and resolve conflict, then that was what made the marriage work. And we studied that for long periods of time, and we taught effective communication and conflict resolution and all of those things. They're very important instrumental things for couples to know in any relationship, not just a marital relationship, but any relationship. But interestingly, increasingly what the social science research shows now is something else or something more beyond just the instrumental. And so to summarise, what the social science research says today about what makes a marriage work, I can do so in 4 points. Firstly, commitment and investment in the relationship. Second, passion and intimacy in the relationship. Thirdly, strong feelings of fondness and generosity. And finally, the realisation that romantic love is important. It's what brings us together, but romantic love in itself is an insufficient factor to sustain marital happiness over a long period of time. It's interesting in conclusion, therefore, that what the last 4 decades of social science research shows is it supports an older wisdom, an older understanding. And this comes the complete circle, if you like, to where Archbishop Coleridge was before. Because that older wisdom and that older understanding, I think, is summarised in the famous words that we all know. Love is patient and kind. Love is not jealous or boastful. It is not arrogant or rude. Love does not insist on its own way. It is not irritable or resentful. It does not rejoice at wrong, but rejoices in the right. Love bears all things, hopes all things, endures all things. Love never comes to an end. Thank you.